I need you to look at something. This is a mass grave in Lithuania. About 3,000 men were thrown into it in December 1812. They were soldiers from Napoleon's Grande Armée, survivors of the retreat from Moscow. Look at how they are laid. No coffins, no formation, just bodies thrown into trenches in a hurry. Whatever killed them fast, and there were too many of them to do anything else. 213 years later, we found their bodies. My name's Joe, and this is one Buried Earth video that is well worth your time. So, Vilnius is the capital of Lithuania, a modern European city around 600,000 people, a beautiful old town, busy modern districts, all the usual. In 2001, construction workers in one of those districts hit something they did not expect. Bones. A lot of them. The initial assumption was Soviet-era Lithuania has plenty of them. The 20th century left mass graves all over the country. But it wasn't the 20th century. It was 189 years older. It was Napoleon's army. And once archaeologists got into the grave, what they found was bigger than anyone else expected. The grave was not a careful military burial. The bodies had been laid in trenches in a hurry, stacked together. This was emergency disposal, not a ceremony. Archaeologists of Vilnius University took over the entire site, and a bioarchaeologist led the work on the human remains. French anthropologists, microbiologists, and historians joined later. Within just a few years, the site had become one of the most important Napoleon-related archaeological projects in Europe. The numbers were extraordinary. About 2,000 to 3,000 individuals in a single burial. Though the precise count does remain uncertain, some of the grave had been disturbed in the 20th century construction before archaeologists arrived. The original number could have been much higher. Most of the dead were still wearing fragments of their uniforms. The discovery was full of personal items as well. Brass buttons, boots, coins, small things that had survived 189 years in the ground because somebody had kept them in their pocket the day they died. The buttons gave the era away instantly. They were Napoleonic, the early 19th century. But the most striking thing was the demographic. Almost all male, almost all young, most in their 20s, with a few teenagers and a few older men. The age distribution matched a military force, not a civilian massacre, and the personal items came from all across Europe. Polish-style religious medals, Italian coins, German uniform fittings, Spanish military buckles. The men buried together had come from different places, different countries, completely different languages, and they had been all thrown into the same trench at the end of all of it. The grave raised even more questions than it answered. Who decided to dump all of these men into a trench instead of giving them proper burials? And what exactly got them all killed? The forensic work began in 2022, and it is still going today. To understand who these men really were and why they ended up in a mass grave in Lithuania, we have to go back 189 years, because in June 1812, this army was the largest force Europe had ever seen. So June 24th, 1812, the Niemen River on the border of Russia. Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed into Russia. Over 600,000 men. The biggest army Europe had ever assembled in one place. Most of them were not French. The army included Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, Swiss, Swedish, Croatian, and Portuguese soldiers. Napoleon's empire stretched across most of continental Europe by 1812. Each part of the empire had to send some troops. This is why the Vilnius grave is so multinational. The men buried together all had the same emperor. They had almost nothing else in common. Why was Napoleon invading Russia though? Tsar Alexander had pulled Russia out of the continental system. Napoleon's economic war with Britain. Napoleon needed to force him back in. He believed one decisive battle would do it. His plan was simple: smash the Russian army quickly and dictate peace terms, then march home before the winter. The plan failed immediately. The Russian commanders, Barclay and Mikhail, refused to fight. Instead, they retreated, and they burned their own villages, farms, and supplies behind where they went. Napoleon's enormous army had to march hundreds of miles through scorched land in the summer heat. Men started dying before they even had seen a single Russian soldier. Heat exhaustion, bad weather, disease everywhere. By the time the army was halfway to Moscow, tens of thousands were already dead. The Grande Armée was bleeding before it had even fought a single battle. Then, in September, they finally got their battle. September 7th, 1812, the Battle of Borodino, 80 miles west of Moscow. The biggest single day of the entire Napoleonic War. 250,000 soldiers fought. About 70,000 became casualties. The Russians retreated again. The French won the field, but they lost a fifth of their army in the process in a single day. Napoleon's force, now down to around 100,000 troops, entered Moscow on September the 14th. Moscow was empty. The Russian population had already evacuated. The Russian governor had ordered the city set on fire. 5 days, 2/3 of Moscow burned. Napoleon's army had captured a ruin. So Napoleon waited. He sat in the Kremlin for over a month, expecting Tsar Alexander to send terms for a surrender. The terms never came. Alexander was 500 miles away in St. Petersburg, simply ignoring him. Outside of Moscow, the situation got worse every single day. Food started running out, horses started dying, Cossacks attacking the French patrols. The first snow started falling. The whole point of this was to be done before winter. On October the 19th, Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat. It had taken 35 days for him to accept that Russia was not going to surrender to a man sitting in a burnt-out city. The decision to retreat was correct, but it was too late. The cold and the disease had a hard start, and the disease story starts before the cold did. In 2006, a French microbiologist named Didier Raoul published a study in the Journal of Infectious Disease. His team had taken several samples from 35 soldiers excavated at the Vilnius grave. They were looking for infectious disease, locked into the tissue, locked into the body lice still trapped in the uniform fabric. What they found was, bear with me on the pronunciation, Rickettsia praecoxii. I hope I got that right. It's a bacterium anyway that causes epidemic typhus, and also Bartonella quintanilla. I'm so sorry about these pronunciations. It's a bacterium that causes trench fever, the disease that would later cripple soldiers in World War I. The transmission story was the body louse. Body lice live in the seams of unwashed clothing. They feed on blood and lay eggs in the fabric. The Grande Armée had been wearing the same uniform since June. No baths, no way to delouse. By the time the men reached Moscow, the lice were everywhere. Some of them were probably carrying thousands of them, and the lice were carrying typhus and trench fever. This was the first hard biological evidence for what historians have suspected for 200 years. The army wasn't just freezing and starving, it was burning with infection. Cold weather makes lice cluster on warm bodies. The colder the men got, the more the lice fed on them. The more that they fed, the faster the pathogens spread. The cold made the disease even worse. The disease made the cold deadlier. Each one fed off of the other. This was absolutely brutal for the entire army. By the time the army left Moscow, the bacteria identified in 2006 was already inside of the men who would later be buried in Vilnius. October 19th, 1812, the army leaves Moscow. Napoleon planned to retreat through the south where the land hadn't been burned. Russian forces blocked that route on October the 24th. The French won the battle, but Napoleon refused to push through. He ordered the army back onto the road that they had come in on, the same scorched road that they had marched along in June. There was nothing left to eat for hundreds of miles, and the cold then arrived. Early November temperatures hit -20 degrees Celsius, late November dropping below -30 degrees. The army didn't even have winter clothing. They should have been home ages ago. Most men were still wearing their summer uniforms. They tried to wrap themselves in anything that they could find: looted curtains, hides stripped from dead animals, blankets stolen from villages. It wasn't enough. Horses froze and dropped dead. Soldiers cut meat from the bodies while they were still warm. Then the horses were gone too. The army began disintegrating. Stragglers fell behind and Cossacks killed them. Disciplined soldiers became dying men trying to survive alone. Dysentery from dirty water, frostbite, and the typhus and trench fever the 2006 study would identify, it was all killing the army from the inside, while the cold killed them from the outside. And then they reached the Berezina River, November 26 to 29th, 1812. Berezina River, in what is now Belarus, the Grande Armée had to cross it to escape encircling Russian forces. The bridges were destroyed. The river was partly frozen but not solid enough to walk on. One man saved what was left of the army, a French engineer named General Jean-Baptiste Eblé. Earlier in the campaign, Napoleon had ordered Eblé to burn the army's platoon bridge equipment to save weight on the retreat. Eblé had quietly disobeyed. He had kept the tools and the heaviest cables. At the Berezina, his engineers stripped wood from the local villages and built 2 makeshift bridges across the freezing river. This guy was an absolute genius. 400 of his men worked in chest-deep water at -20 degrees Celsius, holding up the bridges by hand while the army crossed them from above. The water was freezing their skin. The bridges were collapsing and being rebuilt in real time. Men slipped and drowned in the slush, but the work went on without stopping. Most of those 400 men died within days, hypothermia and disease, but the army did get to cross the river on November the 27th and 28th. When Russian forces arrived in the morning of November 29th, the bridges were still covered by stragglers, the wounded and the slow. Eblé gave the order to burn the bridges. Tens of thousands of men were left on the wrong side. They were killed by the Russians or by the cold, we don't exactly know, but most simply sat down in the snow and just stopped moving. Estimations of the dead at the Berezina vary. Most historians settle on 25,000 to 40,000 people lost in 3 days. General Eblé survived the crossing, but he did die just a few weeks later in Königsberg. The cause was exhaustion. He had given everything he could to those bridges. What was left of the Grande Armée staggered west. They still had hundreds of miles to march before they reached safety. The closest safety was a city called Vilnius. By the time the bones reached Vilnius, the bodies told a different story. So let's get back to this grave in Vilnius. The forensic work on the Vilnius skeletons tells us how these men actually died, not just what killed them. Most of the dead were in their 20s, with a few teenagers and a few older men. The bones carrying the marks of everything that was killing this entire army at once. Frostbite damaged the fingers and toes. Bone resorption set in where the flesh died before the body did. Some skeletons are missing digits entirely, gone before death. Starvation left its own marks as well. Porous bone in the eye sockets from long-term anemia. Muscle attachments wasted where the body had been consuming itself for energy. Disease left inflammation marks running along bone surfaces, lesions where high fevers had damaged the underlying tissue. The Vilnius bones carry all of these signatures. These weren't just soldiers killed cleanly in battle, they were men who had been physically destroyed over the course of months. Their bodies had been breaking down for so long that by the time that they actually died, the death itself was almost incidental. For the most of them, it was all at the same time: cold and disease, hunger and infection, all working on the same exhausted body. The bones tell us what the army system collapse looked like on the body level. This was all happening to them as the dying men reached Vilnius. December 5th, 1812, near a town called Smargen, Napoleon called his marshals together and told them he was leaving. The official reason? A coup attempt in Paris needed his attention. The real reason? The army was dying and he didn't want to die with the army. He left command to Marshal Joachim Murat, his brother-in-law. He climbed into the closest sleigh with a few aides and rode west, ahead of his own troops. He reached Paris on December 18th. The army was still dying behind him. December 9th, 1812, the survivors reached Vilnius. The city was supposed to be safe. Supply depots, warm buildings, hospitals, an intact garrison. The first soldiers arrive, expected some food and shelter. They got chaos. The city couldn't handle what arrived. Tens of thousands of soldiers in 2 days, most of them half dead. The supply depots were either looted or never properly stocked. The hospitals filled within hours, then overflowed. The men were left to die in the streets after that. The healthier soldiers fought the dying ones for shelter. A French sergeant named Adriana Borgona, one of the few survivors to write a memoir, described being unable to stay in the open streets without freezing to death. He recorded being driven away from doorways and warm shelters by his own comrades. Men who had marched together for 6 months were now trying to kill each other for the warmth. Russian forces entered Vilnius on December 10th. The army's command structure had already evaporated. The dead piled up faster than anyone could bury them. The city authorities ordered mass graves to be dug. Soldiers were thrown in altogether, still in their uniforms, still with whatever they had on them when they died. The graves were filled and covered quickly and forgotten for 189 years. And the science of what really killed them keeps changing. In 2025, a team led by Nicholas Raskoven in Paris published a new study in the journal Current Biology. They had used a newer technique called shotgun ancient DNA sequencing on tooth samples from 13 Vilnius soldiers. These were different individuals from the men in the 2006 study that they examined. Shotgun sequencing is a completely different method that they used previously. The 2006 method asked one question: is this specific pathogen present in today's body? The 2025 method asked a much broader question: what is in here at all? It reads every single piece of DNA in the sample. What the 2025 team found was not what anybody had expected. They did not find typhus in their 13 samples. They did not find trench fever either. But what they found instead? Salmonella enterica, the bacteria that causes paratyphoid fever. In 4 of the 13 individuals, paratyphoid spreads through contaminated water and food. In a starving army drinking from frozen ditches, it would have ripped through the ranks. Borrelia recurrentis, the bacterium that causes louse-borne relapsing fever. In 2 of the 13, same transmission as typhus, but a completely different disease. It comes back in waves: fever, then collapse, then fever again, each one leaving the victim weaker and weaker every single time. But here's the part that really matters about all of this. The 2006 study and the 2025 study were not looking at the same men. They were looking at different individuals from the same grave, and they found different diseases. The Vilnius grave does not represent a single epidemic. It represents an army with multiple overlapping diseases that was tearing through different groups of soldiers at the same time. Some had typhus, some had paratyphoid, some had relapsing fever, some had trench fever, some had multiple at the same time. This is what an army system collapse looks like at a biological level. Not one cause, but many. Honestly, I think this is the best current reading, and future papers will probably add some more layers to this, but after doing so much research for this video, I think science is still moving, we're still finding out, but we've got a very, very good idea now. A historian at King's College London named Michael Rowe has put it carefully. He warns that disease alone does not explain the catastrophe of 1812. Russian strategy and French command failure also destroyed this entire army. But the science is incredibly clear on the central point. Vilnius is not where Napoleon's army froze, it is where it broke. 213 years later, after all of these men died, we're still learning about what killed them. The grave in Vilnius is one of the most important Napoleon-era archaeological sites in Europe. It is also one of the most active. Researchers are still publishing on it. The 2025 study will not be the last word. Of the 3,000 or so men that were buried here, most of them are still anonymous. They didn't carry papers. They weren't entered into any roll call where they died. Their names, the villages they came from, the languages they spoke, all completely lost. And that's it from me, guys. Thank you so much for watching. My name's Joe. This was a Buried Earth video that I very much enjoyed making. On screen right now, 2 more videos I think you're gonna absolutely love. And let us know in the comments below, are there any moments in human history that are shocking or brutal, maybe things that most of us don't actually know about yet, that you think would make an amazing video on Buried Earth? Let us know in the comments. I'll see you next time.